Welcome to Face the State. I'm Ariana Bennett. Thank you for joining us. Well, when events like the deadly shooting in Las Vegas happen, they often spark a conversation about mental illness, how to identify it and treat it to hopefully prevent future attacks. Now, mental illness is very common, and more often than not, it's nonviolent, treatable, and really nothing to be ashamed of. But it is a complicated issue. So to help us navigate all of it, we have Dr. Elizabeth Haas, president of the Northern Nevada Psychiatric Association. Dr. Haas, thank you so much for coming on the show.
You're welcome.
Now, when we talk about this shooter, this Las Vegas shooter, it's a tough situation. Everyone wants to know what the motive is. And there's been no documented mental health issue, no violent issues from his past. So is it even safe to assume we're dealing with a mental health issue here?
Not necessarily, right? I mean, you know, the profile of people that that end up doing these mass murders, there is something we can say about that, right? I mean, it does tend to be somebody who's been more isolated, has felt more victimized, has felt more slighted by society, who's out for revenge in some way. Often, like from their teenage years or from early years where there was a lot of bullying or a lot of childhood neglect. But the number of, and usually, unfortunately, white men, but the number of white men that have been slighted and had hard lives and bullied and undergone childhood trauma is far, far, far greater, obviously, than the number of people who do this. So you can't really profile anybody, really. You know, I'd much rather be in the room with a schizophrenic with mental illness than with somebody who is desperate and armed at any moment, you know, so any day. So no, you can't really exactly say, you know. We unfortunately can't really say who's going to become violent, right? Because I mean, I can tell you in the moment when I'm assessing somebody in the emergency room if they're likely to become violent, right? Somebody who's having hallucinations and voices that are telling them to go kill people is sort of the high-risk scenario, potentially. But the best predictor of violence is past violence, right? So what you can see sometimes is like an escalating pattern of violence, an escalating pattern of threats, sometimes some sort of more secretive behavior, a little bit of this idea of transferring money away or changing something, and a lot of social withdrawal, but you can't really predict. And the reason for that is that, you know, your mental state changes across your lifespan, right? I mean, we have heard that Stephen Paddock was a heavy drinker, right? You know, alcohol will give you paranoid delusions if you drink heavily enough for long enough, right? People develop dementias that change their personality, that makes them aggressive, right? So you can't really say, right? And this person who's so wounded, so vengeful right now, when is it going to be that they're going to cross that line, right? It's a hard thing to predict looking forward, although we can say a lot about it in the moment. Yeah.
So when you see something like this happen, and obviously people are always going to want to take the next step forward. So, you know, how do we prevent an attack like this happening? What policies can we enact? What new programs can we put forward? When we see someone like this who seems kind of like an aberration almost, is there something that we can identify in someone like that to prevent something like this? Or is it really just one of those things where you can't predict it at all?
You know, you know, it's a complicated answer, right? I mean, because, you know, as a country, we have 4% of the people in the world, but 50% of the guns in the world, right? And people will say, you know, it's not the gun, it's the person that has the gun, right? But certainly we know that the more guns are out there, the more violent deaths are likely to occur, right? I mean, if you are suicidal and you have a firearm, you have a 97% chance of killing yourself with a firearm, right? But if you make an overdose attempt, you have a 5 or 7% chance of dying, right? So they're just much more lethal, and the more of them that are around, the more likely this thing is going to happen, right? This kind of thing is going to happen. So, you know, yes, it's partly the guns, right? It's also about guns that have things like, you know, bump stock barrels that can fire 90, you know, rounds in 10 seconds. But in terms of, you know, sort of understanding how this particular person comes to this particular point, we work a lot to try to understand the stories of people like this, but we can't really be very specific, unfortunately. Yeah.
So when we see mass shootings happen so often in America. I mean, this is now becoming something that's so common that we don't even react in the same way that we used to. You know, we don't have the reaction that we had to Columbine now, because it's just become this common part of American life. Why is that the case here? I mean, is it just now a part of our cultural landscape that people are maybe more likely to do it because they're exposed to the reality? Or is it something else entirely?
I think so. I mean, we've had just a really dramatic increase in the number of these things in the last few years. And while we don't really know this the way we do about suicide, we do know that there can be copycat suicides, right? And that we know that people that watch more violence or more involved with violent video games are a little bit more likely to be violent. So we know that these things contribute, right? And so once you start seeing more of it, it sort of gives you the idea. I mean, many of the mass murderers, I think, have actually, used TV shows for information, right, to plot their strategies. I mean, so certainly culture contributes. I think also, poverty contributes. I mean, we're at a very, very difficult time in our country in terms of the amount of wealth that is in the hands of the few, and a lot of people are really, really struggling, and they feel very, very marginalized, victimized, that there's been a lot of injustice. And so I think that's also contributing.
What would be your best advice to those of us who, might know somebody struggling with mental illness, not sure if that person could ever turn violent or do something along those lines? I mean, is there anything that people can do?
Ask, right? And ask a lot about their history, talk to people who know them. Right? Like I said, the best predictor is past violence. Look at the number of weapons that person might be interested in having. Listen to the kinds of fantasies that they're describing of what they'd like to do, ideas of vigilante justice, taking things into their own hands. And just sort of try to explore what is their fantasy of being powerful and getting this kind of revenge. Substance abuse is a huge contributor to violent events actually happening. Domestic violence is something to take a look for. So those are the things that I would really look for.
Okay. Now, on the other side of this coin, we have all these victims of this shooting. We have not just the people who were shot, but the people who survived, who now are going to have to deal with probably their own version of a post-traumatic stress. And then you have, on the third tier, people who see this happening in their home state, watch the videos online or on TV, and then feel secondhand traumatized. What kind of an effect are you expecting to see on our population from something like this?
Well, for the people that are directly affected, I mean, this is just a huge loss, and it's a traumatic loss. It's an unfair loss, so they're just very deeply affected by a kind of profound grief, What people go on to develop are anxiety disorders, depression, problems with drinking too much, and post-traumatic stress disorder, right? So those are the things that you're likely to see, and you're more likely to see it depending on how close the person was, how vulnerable they were in the moment, whether they felt that vulnerability, and whether they came into it with a vulnerability of some kind. And that might be a recent hardship in life, or it might be a very distant hardship. But if you're somebody that's been recently really struggling with a lot of anxiety and stress, you want to be more careful, right, about how much of this media you expose yourself to. And give yourself the facts so you're not worrying about what's out there without information, but don't watch things over and over. Don't pursue every single article. Don't go back to the TV set multiple times. I mean, we know that has really traumatized people, with 9/11 and some of the other events like this. Yeah.
And understand that, they're not alone, right? There are going to be a lot of people who are experiencing this, and it's normal.
Yeah, it's totally normal. Connect to your family, connect to your friends. Your support system is your best resource. The Nevada Department of Health has wonderful resources for dealing with the consequences of this kind of thing available: coping strategies, breathing strategies, relaxation strategies, ways of creating comfort and safety. I think I just want to mention that the thing that most helps people in situations like this, if they happen again, is to be prepared. right? So learn what it's like to go through something like this and practice, and that can give you some sense of control.
And that applies to all of us. I mean, everyone who, empathizes with this situation, has seen the videos. It's a really hard thing to watch in our home state, and I know it's horrible anytime it happens, but when it happens to a place that you're familiar with, it hits more close to home. It feels more personal.
Yeah, it's just so profoundly sad for everybody.
Okay, so reach out, find the resources. Anywhere in particular that you would direct people as a good starting point?
As I said, the Nevada Board of Health has a whole list of resources, both in the south of the state and up here. The Nevada Psychiatric Association on their website has links to multiple resources. Many, if not most, of the counseling centers in the state are providing free counseling for anybody who would like to talk about it at any level of exposure. We're here for you. We really want to talk you through whatever feelings you're having. So.
Absolutely. Okay, well, we've got a little less than a minute left. Any last message to people?
I don't know. Hold your loved ones very, very close. This is the kind of time where community support is just so important, and it's really an opportunity, right, for us to come together as Nevadans.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time. I sure appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, well, that is it. Coming up, actually, on Face the State, helping women escape domestic violence isn't always a simple task, probably often not a simple task, but it is an important one here in Nevada. I'll find out how you do it, how we can help, right after the break.